coming weekend, coming right up 3 days. Isn't that great? That's owing to Dr. King. What that means is our first discussion of Monday, this coming Monday, can't occur in its normal slot. And so I have a, what do you call it, a smorgasbord, a menu. You can choose what works for you. One, the first option is to simply come to Amy's discussion instead of Sahi's, and that solves the problem, right? I understand that many of you have class right after this, those of you who are in lab too, and so that doesn't work for you. So then the second option, and the one that's most immediate, that shouldn't say 10, that should say 11 to 12:30, which is my already existing office hour. Okay, if you look at these, that should say 11 to 12:30, 90 minutes. Is there anyone who is excluded from both of these? Raise your hand. Crap. Okay, that's all right. We will figure it out. Give me just a little more time. Pardon, you two?
Would Wednesdays go up to like past 12?
No.
Okay, no.
Yeah. So remember your discussions. So the reason there's a 3-hour slot scheduled for your labs is some of the labs really take 3 hours. The discussions are more like it's between 1 and 2 hours. At the longest, 90 minutes is a nice hour. Does that make sense? Okay. So I still need to deal with the other issues. And in fact, those of you who raised your hands again. Sahan, Mary, Kelly. Oh, it works for you? Okay, good. Anyone who can't make it, God, I hesitate to have you email me. So email your TA. They will respond to you better than I will. Oh, what else does it say up here? So we're working on this. Don't be freaked. It's worth it to have a 3-day weekend and remember Dr. King. And we'll get through it. In terms of location, as I said, we're probably going to have our discussions upstairs in that room 280, which is right near my office upstairs, and that it gets us away from the construction noise. I will announcement on campus about that to confirm. Now, I want to start up the lecture, but for the next our discussion, there's always going to be something you read at home, something you bring to class, and a homework afterwards. That's just going to be, so when you go online, Thursday or Friday, tomorrow or the next day, you'll find a new folder that's called Discussion 1, and in there you'll find something to read about what the topic of the discussion is. You'll find a case study to apply, because what we're reading is how to do case studies and collect information in a medical setting. So you'll have a case study upon which to think about that. And then you will fill out a handout, which is actually your personal medical history. So the information that we need as a staff to know your safety exercise. Right? If someone has exercise-induced asthma, doesn't mean we're not doing a test, but it does mean we're going to have albuterol present and probably give it to you before you start, if that makes sense. Right? Yay! The American College of Sports Medicine guidelines now starts to be your main text in lab, and you could read chapters 2 and 3. And I forget, did I post up a link? I thought I posted up a link to that. It doesn't matter. Yeah, just. You're telling me too many different things. Did I put up a link? Okay, good. So then you have to figure out the conversion between the 10th edition and the 9th edition where I lose all interest. So if TA wants to do that or whatever, that's great. But that's one of the, so frustrating. They update the editions as quick as they can to screw you guys out of big money. So I long ago learned to leave it on an old edition as long as the edition is up to date. Because a lot of times the updates of editions are not changing things. It saves you boku bucks. You can find the used text in the bookstores, and I don't have to redo my reading list every time they make a new edition. That's what it's about. I'm trying to save costs for you guys. We should go on. Oh, last thing. We're going to have in class, our first lecture into your quiz the Wednesday after Dr. King's Day, a week from today, and it will cover up through today's lecture, but not beyond. Has anyone, these first lectures are supposed to be a review of stuff you've heard. There may be slightly different notes, depending. You'll see today I'm going to emphasize the energy costs of the heart, because in heart disease, that's one of the primary problems. If you can't meet the heart's energy demand, it dysfunctions. So, but these are supposed to be mostly reviewed. Concepts you've heard before may be applied a little different. All right, we may run out of time today, but I know that the next lecture has run in. Yes, Steve?
What's the format?
Oh, the quizzes are all multiple choice answer. Yeah, there'll be a, I think, Scantron, just because of the time. I'll need to break them on the time limit.
And what about
The pre-lab quizzes, as you guys discovered, are mostly short answer. I'm not sure if the TAs know yet. You guys know that there's quizzes before the discussions, aren't there? Amy or something. Did I see something? There you go.
Actually, I can't say it's
Louder. What?
never mind.
Old man, can't hear.
I can't see it because what happened that
Okay. So I believe that there'll always be a multiple a short answer quiz before each meeting of the class discussion. I think that. I just built the class, I don't know. So, on to today. So, I have a one-slide summary of hearts, what creates outgoing blood. And then I want to turn towards this idea that, you know, the heart is a service organ, but it has its own needs. And so we're going to spend some time talking about, yeah, and what does it cost the heart to perform this service for the body? And then at the end, we'll start to move into topics that shift us towards thinking about electrocardiology, which I think starts up next week. So we're going to start to think specifically about how you don't get no contraction unless you have electricity flowing across the surface of the heart. And there are some subtleties of the heart. Because it doesn't have motor units and separate nerve terminals, the heart has to be intrinsically organized. I wish I had this property. That automatically it has to be self-organizing. And so we'll talk a little bit about where that comes from. So once again, this is a slide of the four traditional determinants of cardiac output. Heart rate, I said that wrong. Four traditional determinants of cardiac output. Afterload, preload, we have contractility, 1, 2, 3, and heart rate. Remember, heart rate cannot positively influence cardiac output unless stroke volume is being maintained. So my invisible elephant in the living room that I'm always hammering on is venous return. Without venous return, there is no cardiac output. You cannot function like increase the heart's function simply by driving heart rate if there's no additional venous return. All right. So that's sort of a one-slide summary last time. And here's today's lecture. We're going to talk about both the contraction happening, and then we're going to talk about how do we meet the energy need of making contractions, because you guys know they cost. So so I think the next like 14 slides are just calcium. So ask you a question in the next 14 slides. The answer is calcium. Like when you're in medical school and you're in orthopedics, they'll ask you a question. The bones? It's amazing how often it works out. So this is showing you that it's just like skeletal muscle, that the amount of calcium released inside the cell is the primary determinant of how many actinomycin cross bridges you form. One of the subtleties, as I'm saying again, is muscles could be recruited almost fiber by fiber, whereas the heart always goes all at once. Here we have, in the presence of activated calcium, and this is, here's the calcium flux that triggers that contraction. And without having stimulated the cell. Here, we have cyclic AMP, right, which is a downstream flow from catecholamines. And for the same stimulus, you get much more calcium release, and therefore much more contractile force. It's about double. So in the heart, calcium is the queen of contractile force. That's what's making you happy. That's what regulates. I want to throw in a little more calcium, and by the way, notice if calcium is spilled quickly, you get a quicker rise. And by the end of the lecture, I'm hoping that you'll appreciate one more thing. Look at the rate of calcium put away. That's a term. Whenever I say sequestration, you guys don't like it. Calcium being sequestered back into the SR. See how much faster that is? And that's weird. I mean, I understand that if you spill more, you spill more, but notice both the rate of relaxation of the muscle, the heart, is relaxing faster, you're putting calcium away. We need to understand that process. That's called lusotropy. Lusotropy is movement towards relaxation. For those of you who don't speak Greek, you can think of it as tropy means movement and lucy means loose. Moving you towards loosens. That's not the real at all. So now we're ready to start thinking about, up to now we've been thinking about what does the heart do for the rest of the body. Now I want to talk about the energy costs. So we're going to think a little bit about where does the nutritive blood supply come from, oxygen flow, what aspects of the contraction are creating ATP use, that stuff. So I think the first place to start is remember that the ventricular cavities, the atrial cavities, the blood in there is not available to the muscle for it to use. Right? It's separated. There is no capillary distance in that setting. And so it's sort of a water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. It's very tantalizing, if you know the myth of the Tantalus. But it's full of blood, but that blood's not available to it. Just like any muscle, the heart needs a distributed capillary bed that intertweens between the cells, intertweens. I have a lot of good words today. And though that arterial supply is called the coronaries, from the Latin word for crown, como la cerveza messina. Those of you who drink beer, Corona, its symbol is a crown. And so you turn it upside down for the coronaries because their spurs hang downward on the heart. I'm sure the early anatomists were thinking about the crown of Christ pushed down. So here's a cross-section of heart muscle to prove this point. This would be the blood hole, the ventricular cavity, and the blood in here can't service this. What can service it is the surface coronary arteries, the first vessels off the aorta. The heart immediately feeds itself, like any good mother, first sees to her own needs, and then takes care of the rest of the body. So the very first branches off the aorta are the right and left coronaries. The big vessel flows upon the surface. And you'll think, when you start to think about it, you'll know why in a moment. And then it drops out. It's like a tree that's fallen on its side and then drops roots off downward into the muscle. And so these are the coronaries. These are the coronary arterioles. And they feed the muscle going down the capillary. Now, as you look at this, a couple of questions. We talked last time about the more resistors and the narrower the tubes get, the more the pressure head drops. So when you look at this, which part of the heart muscle is most vulnerable in terms of the blood is just barely getting there, or it's getting there under the lowest possible capillary pressure? Here. It's the most distant, and the ramifications are the smallest. And this is true of any capillary bed, but because this has such a tight organization with the big vessels with the high pressure here, it means what we often call the subendocardium. The endocardium is a single cell layer that separates blood from muscle. This area, the subendocardium, has the lowest relative perfusion pressure for its task. And I bring that up because as you might guess, when you have a heart attack, first one to go, subendocardium. You'll see there's some tricks we can do to help diagnostic methods. Now, another interesting thing is, like any muscle, those of you who have EXP 101 will remember this. When a muscle contracts, it closes in on itself. And these little tiny tubes are very soft. They're way softer than a rubber tube. So what happens to blood flow to the heart muscle when the heart contracts? It stops, which is a bit weird. So as the heart is pressurizing the blood and then squirting it out into the aorta, its own blood supply goes very, very low. So the vessels inside the wall. So here's coronary blood flow, not aortic blood flow. Coronary blood flow in relation to whether the heart muscle is in contraction or relaxed. Look how weird. So when the heart muscle is in the midst of contraction, it falls down to a blood supply that's like a quarter, a fifth of what it needs. So most of the actual nutrient supply happens when the heart is relaxing like a sponge and opening up. That's when it gets its blood supply, is during diastole. Make sense? So it's kind of funny, again, using this image as the heart as the caring mother. It's sort of like, serve the body, serve myself. Serve the body, serve myself. Serve the body, serve myself. It's an oscillation of blood supply between the two. Make sense? There's some other interesting things versus, so this is the same as skeletal muscle, that you can't pump blood through tiny soft vessels when it's contracted, right? There's some differences, but they're mostly that among different muscle types, we saw that cardiac cells are single nucleated and small cells that have their tendons mostly between cells. Like the whole system is connected like a mesh or a web. And then among all the cells, the cardiac muscle is the most, all muscle cells, cardiac is the most aerobic. And this is going to be quite obvious. It uses oxygen really well. Well, first off, see I put rest here. In a resting human, is the heart still? No, the heart is the organ that never rests. And so I've told you several times that a skeletal muscle can easily demand 20 times its resting oxygen supply. Well, that's where the heart is right now for you guys. It's resting oxygen supply needs very, very high because it never rests. It's actually always, there's another beat coming in the next half second, right? So it really doesn't have, because of that, oxygen extraction, what I call the tissue pull of oxygen into the heart muscle. In a resting skeletal muscle, you take maybe 1 in 4 of the oxygens. And so extraction has the capacity to increase in a skeletal muscle if you work it harder. Because of this issue that the heart isn't really very resty when it's at rest, it has already maximized extraction. The gradients for oxygen pulling capillary oxygen to the mitochondria are already maximized. So you start to see, ooh, the heart's a little precarious. This is good news for us because what it devolves down to is, because you already have maximal extraction, the only way to meet increases in work in the heart, the only way to bring in more blood, the only way to bring in more oxygen is to dilate and bring in more blood. So the heart is absolutely blood flow dependent. Oh, notice when I say that the heart, think of the heart at rest is already kind of a maximized aerobic structure. Notice its natural capillary density is something like double to 3 times as many capillaries as skeletal muscle. So think of it as the most maximally adapted muscle you could get for oxygen transport. Sure, that makes sense. Okay? So now we get into something we'll talk about several times in different tones during lecture, which is so the oxygen supply in the heart needs to match how many oxygens per minute are disappearing in the heart muscle, or bad things happen. In fact, that you could say that is the definition of ischemia. If there is not enough blood flow and the oxygen it carries to meet the demands for oxygen use, that condition is called ischemia. Iske in Greek means the smaller. You know how you have the ilium means the broad one. The ischium means the smaller one, for those of you who are anatomists. And emia means blood, so this word means literally too little blood. And so that would be the condition if the blood supply couldn't meet the demand. So we should probably talk a little bit about so blood flow through the coronary happens mostly during diastole when it's not being kinked off. The external compression basically cancels the ability to have blood flow during the heartbeat itself. And it's a function of the driving pressure, which is basically arterial pressure. So as long as you have arterial pressure being put into the arteries, then the resistance of the coronary vasculature flow is the primary controller. The coronary vasculature is exquisitely tuned to adenosine. Adenosine. You see how if the heart's energy state was dropping, how adenosine would become more plentiful and would be an indicator we need more blood flow here? That's what it's about. Okay. So that's the supply side. Oh, and as you'll see, because I've already intimated this, and we're talking about it in lab, in old people, the number one reason that supply drops is a goomba, to use a medical slang. An atherosclerotic lesion has grown inside one of the coronaries, creating an internal resistance to flow. It wasn't there when they were 10 or 20, and restricts their blood supply. This is the basis of atherosclerotic symptomatology, is the blockage of flow. Okay, supply. Now on the demand side, that's where we're going to spend like the next 5 or 6 lectures, 5 or 6 slides. Demand turns out to be, so what's the primary job of the heart? The primary job of the heart is to pressurize the blood. That's a function of its contractility. And you can use a rough index of contractility by just taking the systolic blood pressure. So a rough index of contractility is simply systolic blood pressure. Then how often does the heart pressurize the blood? Well, that's the heart rate. So it turns out that just multiplying these two factors together gives you more than 90%. And if someone, as long as someone has a normal heart size, which all of you have, this factor becomes negligible as a differentiator. And so it starts to approach 95 or 99% of the work of the heart. It's just heart rate times blood pressure, which is just a fantastically useful accident or fundament. So what it means is, someone comes into you in the ER and someone is wondering, gosh, I wonder what the demand on their heart is. Take their heart rate, multiply it times their systolic blood pressure, you got it. So let's just do that real quickly. That's called the rate pressure product, the heart rate systolic blood pressure product. And if you're a cardiologist, you often just say, oh, you know, the double product. The two things we multiply together the most often. So, everyone sees a blood pressure curve. As usual, they've screwed up the thing by not putting units of time, so I'm going to arbitrarily define that time is from 1 second is from here to here. One cardiac cycle. That makes the heart rate 60. This is very convenient. See that? So I'm defining it from here to here is 1 second. So right here, we have a heart rate of 60 times a systolic blood pressure of 120. 20. And so we get a value of, the values of the double product always come out in the thousands, so many people like to write it. What I actually got was this number, 7,200, which most people would write as 72 times 10 to the second. It's just easier. When you write it in this form, it fits on the same graph as heart rate and systolic blood pressure. Am I making sense? So, how much? Here's someone who's gone, I did a workout yesterday and I touched 175 at the end of my sprint. So let's see, as far as heart rate. And I'm sure I got my blood pressure towards 200. Let's see how hard my heart was working during my workout yesterday. So I'm going to say that within this gap, I can actually, I love measuring stuff. God, I love to measure. So here we have 3 cardiac cycles. Oh, 1 cycle, 2 cycles, 2.5 cycles. Let's use 3. We have 3 cardiac cycles. This is the heart rate 180 happening. And the blood pressure is now, let's use 180 because that's closer to what it really is. So I take 180 times 180, 180 squared. $32,400, or as we would say, 324 times 10 to the second. And so the energy demand has gone up. That's more than 4 times, isn't it? Well, you sure hope this person's coronary is dilated to tolerate that. And see, you double with a 15% dilation, so I think you'd have to be able to dilate. The coronary has to be at least 30 to 40% more open in order to accommodate that. Am I making sense? Okay, good. That was the lecture.
Question?
Yes.
So just to clarify, that first number was the calculation for the expenditure?
At rest.
At rest, so like
Yeah.
60 beats per minute.
Right, 60 beats per minute, blood pressure 120. Hey, by the way, just for interest, several of you noticed I have high blood pressure. Take my meds in the morning. So by the end of Monday's lab, I let some of the males measure my blood pressure because I'm at the low point in my daily dose. So my blood pressure was 140 over 90. Among the many bad things that high blood pressure does, think about what that did to the energy cost in order to rest. Oh, and my heart rate, because I was sitting upright and teaching, was at least 80. So you could do this number again using 80 times 140 and see how much extra energy is going into feeding my resting heart in the presence of high blood pressure. Does that make sense? Did that answer the question you were asked with Tom? So we only have one more element to talk about, which is kind of fun, because you get to ignore it. You know, there's always like something you get to ignore. As long as the heart is of a normal size, you don't have to think too much about this. Everyone in this room, I don't care what your wall stress is, because it's normal. Right, it kind of drops out of the calculation. Now, if someone has an enlarged heart, then you have to think about wall stress, and particularly pathologically enlarged hearts are the ones that have this problem. Leon, was it you who brought up the idea of, we know that athletes have big hearts, and then you often hear a relative say, oh, my grandfather had an enlarged heart, with the implication that that's bad. Was that you who brought that up? Yeah. So realize, if you think about it, there's a paradox. You're aware of 2 different kinds of enlarged heart, one of which seems to be good, and one of which seems to be bad. We'll spend at least a week discussing how one would tell the difference. Wall stress would be one of the ways. So we just figured out these 2. We only have to think about wall stress when the heart is enlarged. So we're going to do that for a moment, and this will not become useful until we get to our 3rd segment of the class where we start to talk about heart disease. So wall stress is a phenomenon that relates to the law of Laplace. And I do not know how anyone else teaches this concept without a balloon. I constantly see teachers trying to teach this without a balloon, and it's just but stupid to even try. You need a balloon to think about the law of Laplace. Okay, I have a balloon, true? Now we're going to do an experiment. Sarah, I want you to feel the balloon. There, squeeze. Feel it down here at a very small radius where I entered the air. Which one is tenser? Maybe the front of the room is less keen than the back of the room. Again, feel the balloon at the narrow neck, and then feel the big part, which is tense. Now, when you first make this phenomenon, see more pressure in the big part. That can't be true, because what creates airflow? Differentials in pressure. If there was lower pressure here than here, this would shrink and this would grow. The pressure, there's no obstructions inside this balloon. I guarantee you the pressure is equal throughout. What your fingers are feeling is not pressure, it is wall tension. You're feeling wall tension. And notice that when you look at the law of Laplace, it's saying that tension is a function of the pressure inside the balloon, which is the same here and here. And the radius from the center outward. The radius. So high radius here, tense. Low radius here, not tense. One way to think, it's hard to think about this, but one way to think about it is what actually creates the tension in the balloon. It is the number of molecules hitting the surface, and when you have a very small radius, there's fewer molecules impacting the wall of the balloon to keep it tense. I'm not very good with physics explanations, but that's what it is. So in the law of Laplace, that has much less wall tension than this. And that relates to hearts. There's one more factor that we often use. So the tension in the wall is going to be a function of the pressure inside times the radius divided by the thickness of the wall. So this is a compensatory thing. If you can thicken the wall, you can drop the tension therein. Okay? So now let's apply the law of Laplace a little bit. So here's a normal heart. We've cut it horizontally, thrown away the atria, and we're looking at the left ventricle and the right ventricle, which means we're looking at it from below. For a patient on the table, that would be left, that would be right. There's the blood hole, the Vienna sausages, and the papillary muscles of the mitral valve, and there's the wall thickness. So notice that that's the radius. Well, radius is half of this. And over here, the radius is very nearly double if you took it overall. So this dilated heart, this is someone with dilated cardiomyopathy, they have a sick heart. The wall tension here, having doubled, now becomes a significant additional cost in terms of oxygen consumption for this heart. Notice that if you look really carefully, the thickness of the wall in several places, more on the free side than on the septal side. But the ventricular wall here seems as though it's trying to thicken. Why would that be? That would be a compensation to drop the pressure back down. And that gives you a sense this person was pretty early in the process. Late in cardiomyopathy, that will fail. You can only grow each cell so big, and then it fails. Here's another example with a truly dilated cardiomyopathy. So now you have everything working against the system, this sick system. Then you've doubled the radius or more, and then you've actually thinned the wall. And so the wall tension, this thing is going to be like a giant tense balloon. Ventricular rupture is very rare, but this is the kind of ventricle that would be allowed to rupture. Okay. Oh, and so they made a calculation, and wall stress is at least double, more than double, depending on where you are. So, last example, talking about the law of Laplace, which we won't have to worry about too much until we get there. I like this. Dr. Harris found this. So here's two sets of hot dogs of different size. I guess they're called brats when they're really big. These are really big. These are smaller. Presumably the pig intestine they've been shoved into is the same pig intestine. So the wall that's retaining these is similar. So why does this one have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, twice as many splits per dog? That's a scientific measurement, splits per dog, as these ones. Do you get it? Read law of Laplace. Cooking on the same grill, It is the smaller dog that has a smaller radius and therefore lower wall tension, and so you do not split as often as the larger one. Pop.
Okay.
Oh, I'm so delighted I got that far. Is that okay? Are you guys okay with the law of LaPlace? Whenever you get confused with the law of LaPlace, go get a balloon. Truly, the only way I can understand it. If I didn't have a balloon, I couldn't teach you. Wasn't anything to try to teach you without a balloon. Why would you do that? You know the balloons that the clowns use? The really long ones? Those are really good. Because there's one part that blows up and then the tip is often empty. That's a really good law of LaPlace. All right, on to the last portion of the lecture. This would be a fine time if you want to ask anything. Yes?
So in the dilated ventricle, because there would be greater tension, that means there would be a greater amount of energy.
Yeah, so strangely, you have this giant heart. And its energy consumption may actually be 2 times or 3 times as much for the same stroke volume. To kick out 70 mils, even though its ejection fraction might only be 10%, that's a very small ejection fraction. How can that cost anything? Well, to some extent, the wall tension is taking over as the predominant source of energy.
In this case, with CM, would this person not be able to increase their wall thickness to exercise because of this problem? Or
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the few. Well, that particular person can't exercise at all because we have their heart capturing that. But yes, you're quite right. That in dilated cardiomyopathy, the ability of the heart to make more of the heart's adaptational energies are distracted into pathology, the less capacity we'll have to adapt to the normal stresses. And this is the whole field. We'll end the class there our last week about cardiac rehabilitation, where someone comes to you with a broken heart, so to speak, and they can exercise, but good golly, you need to know what you're doing. Because certain forms, if you push that person up to 220 minus their age times 70, I'm going to push you to 70% of your maximal heart rate as predicted by your age. The likelihood that they're going to just go over is really high. And so that's another reason why this class is useful. Several of graduates from this class have gone into the field of cardiac rehabilitation as a next step. Nothing.
Is the permeability of the capillary vessels in the heart an issue like this? Elsewhere, are there lymphatic vessels in the heart that take up?
Wow, I don't know, and my presumption is no. Good God, I have to think about that. No, you don't ever get cardiac edema unless you have liquefaction, unless a piece of the heart has died and then it gets remodeled. I have no idea. That's a really good question.
We're talking about outflow stops from contraction, so I imagine venous flow is now pumped back.
Yeah. Yeah, so it has to have nearly perfect balancing of the Starling-Landis equation for efflux in and influx across the capillary. Well, I'm going to ask Ezra that. Cardiologist.
What exactly triggers the dilated cardiomyopathy?
Oh, that's a whole disease that we're going to start. And you want to know the final answer? Death of cardiac cells. So remember, does the cardiac muscle population have satellite cells? No, we're sort of jumping ahead, doesn't it? So if it doesn't have satellite cells, it can't replace damage. So if one myocyte dies, if you have 100 myocytes all doing a certain job and one dies, well, the 99% have to work harder. And then another one dies, oh crap, now everybody has a 2% higher workload. See what's happening?
So does the ejection fraction get affected before they're diagnosed, or?
The ejection fraction will fall in proportion to how many cardiac cells they've lost. Yeah, we'll study that. I promise. You're now a month ahead, but that's good. I appreciate you guys being here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. We're going to review excitation contraction coupling. How does muscle make force? And you guys are comfortable with this. The special place that we're going to wind up is thinking about how does the heart organize the force and timing that it generates in absence of specific nerve fibers at the brain and cerebellum activating parts of the heart in sequence, because that's not what happens. So that's where we're headed. So out of the sinoatrial node, and being the first to depolarize, comes depolarization currents that then are spread through the intercalated discs and Z lines of the myocardial cells, and the whole thing goes off. This is the part of the lecture that's calcium, calcium, calcium. So much of this is similar to skeletal muscle, right? That you're familiar in the skeletal muscle with having a T-tubule, that the cell membrane is in continuity with sort of a manhole or persic hole that allows the electricity to penetrate way deep into the muscle, right? And we discovered that when electricity, usually via the ryanodine receptor, when that stimulates across the gap, the sarcoplasmic reticulum allows calcium to flood the cell. And that creates contraction. Remember, calcium binds to the troponin C, which yanks the tropomyosin off of the binding sites on actin and allows contraction to occur. All of this is the same in skeletal muscle with just a couple of changes. One is just nomenclatural. What we call a triad in skeletal muscle, one manhole and two wraps, they call a dyad. So it may be that we discovered this later and realized that the sarcoplasmic reticulum is not really separate, it's all one big web. But they call it a dyad, it's just nomenclature. So here's the T-tubule. Electricity comes down here and then is converted into calcium release. I think this is totally cool. We didn't have electron micrographs back in the day when I was a puppy. So we can now actually visualize the structure. This is where you're doing electron microscopy and rotating the sample to get a tomogram. And so here, look up here. Picture this as a cell that clearly must be going that way. And they've ripped off the surface of the cell. And so there's Z lines. This is what we're going to blow up, is this. So they blow this up, and what you see in electron micrograph is a manhole, the hole going down into the cell. And it's surrounded by a bilayer. This is the T-tubule wrapped around with the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When you blow the whole thing up, you find that the T-tubules, they kind of almost ramify. They come from any surface inward. They connect, and anywhere you go, the T-tubule is wrapped by sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's almost like a tube that comes down into the muscle cell, and you've wrapped saran wrap around it. Or a plastic bag would be even better, because it's two-layer. Does that make sense? Okay, I just think it's amazing. These are the mitochondria, because the calcium you spill is going to cause a contraction, use ATP, and so you need mitochondria in your body. I just think that's amazing. So here's a difference in excitation contraction coupling. What do you suppose the difference is? Remember, in this segment, you just always say calcium. Calcium. Cardiac muscle is very rich in a special sarcolemmal calcium channel that takes external calcium in the interstitial space, and brings it into the cell. This is called an L-type calcium channel. And it's almost peculiar to cardiac cells. There are other places, but they're rich in cardiac cells. And so this is often called triggering calcium, and you'll see why in a moment. So electricity across the surface of the cell allows more triggering calcium to enter. So instead of a dihydropyridine receptor, the cardiac cell uses calcium as its link. So watch this and try not to panic. So there's your triggering calcium. So if you have a T-tubule, they put this as though it's the surface of the cell. I think it'd be more honest if this outside here was a T-tubule. And so you have electricity propagating down on the outside of the sarcolemma. It hits one of these L-type calcium channels. That opens a flood of extracellular calcium. And the ryanodine receptor then in cardiac muscle is not so tuned to electricity. You know, I never thought of this. There's so much electricity flooding around the cardiac, and the action potential is sustained so long. Maybe that's why they've done this, why it's evolved this way, is because there is electricity and the electrical stimulation of the heart. The action potential of a heart muscle is like 50 times longer than a nerve action potential. So that may be part of what this is to get electricity confined to the surface and use calcium purely. Anyway, the calcium flows in under electrical stimulation, and it's the calcium that binds to the ryanodine. And so, strangely, you get calcium-sensitive calcium release. It almost sounds like a positive feedback. Calcium-sensitive calcium release. Okay. There it is. Sicker. Calcium-induced calcium release. That's a uniqueness of cardiac tissue. By the way, here's an action potential in a heart. And remember how in a nerve it would just go up and down really, really fast, 5 milliseconds or something? See that long hump? What do you think causes that long sustaining? Yeah. We'll look at that next time. But yeah, it's that long sustaining created by calcium. By the way, if you have a long action potential, it means you're spilling calcium for a long time. What does that mean about the duration of the contraction? Yeah, hearts don't twitch, they contract. And then this is a functional thing for blood flow. So that's probably about as far as we should go. Let's see where we head next. Calcium, notice all the little reds. Calcium. Yeah, we'll talk about phospholamban next time. And we've only got about 4 slides to go to finish this lecture. Right. Okay? Yay. Those of you who are going to lab, haste thee to lab, haste thee to the wedding. I will drop in Amy. I'll let you get started and do the things. The exception would be that if there is clamor and noise and stuff, don't fight with them, just get me. Call me upstairs, 752-0704, and I'll come down and fight like you teach. Why is it there? So this is inside the cell. And so, yeah, this gap here is, this membrane should be right up against the external membrane because it's normally quite a small space. So the calcium that flows in, this is an E2 building, the calcium that flows across this membrane should immediately be surrounding the receptors right here. To deceive it, and immediately start to release it. Oh no, what they often say is maximize afterload reduction. Can we reduce that? They want to reduce the afterload to the very edge of consciousness. That's what it's hard. That's what happens to us in sleep. Right? Our heart rates and blood pressure go as low as they ever go. And so it's great that we're laying down and paralyzed because the heart uses the extra energy in its cells, the ATP thereby freed up. Actually used for protein synthesis and all these other beta guide the circadian rhythms and showed that heart nighttime here itself. Today